Hello, Internet out there, whether you're on X, Facebook, or YouTube, or somewhere else archived later. This is David Rovics with I guess we can call it a special edition of This Week with David Rovics, the podcast. I'll be talking to Peter Phillips, having a little discussion about his new book, which is folks might remember that I used to do a lot of interviews with people a few years ago during the lockdown period, and I kind of drifted away from that as touring picked up again, but I'm getting back into it as of right now, and maybe I'll do more, host more discussions like this in the future, although probably not with the frequency that I was doing back in 2020. And if anybody on Facebook, YouTube, or X has any comments, I'll be able to see your comments or questions for Peter. And this will all be archived later. If you look up This Week with David Rovics, wherever you get your podcasts, it'll be there. And and on other places as well. Peter Phillips was a longtime professor at Sonoma State University, was a longtime director of Project Censored, and has written many books, including Titans of Capital, How Concentrated Wealth Threatens Humanity, which just came out a few months ago, and it is as timely as it could possibly be. Peter, great to see you again. And the book is a resource, more than at least as much as you're telling the story about the situation with wealth concentration in the world. You are actually naming a lot of names and listing a lot of in entities with which these people are involved, and it's people used to. I remember people talking about power structure analysis as a term. I don't know if that term is very commonly used, but it is a fascinating and terrifying book. And I wondered, maybe just would you just start by describing what it is you were trying to do with this book, and why you thought it was a good idea to update the last book that you wrote on a very similar subject 7 years ago?
5 years ago,
5 years ago.
Giants
Mm-hmm.
came out, the global power elite. And at that time, we identified all the investment management companies, those like BlackRock and State Street and some of those, that had over $1 trillion of capital that they were managing. And we thought, wow, $1 trillion is really a lot, you know. And BlackRock at that time had a couple of trillion. And that was interesting in that the 17 companies over $1 trillion, they had a concentrated wealth of $48 trillion. So, you know, that was impressive. And that was, you know, a couple hundred people managing that amount of wealth. In 5 years, it's massively increased. That's what Titans of Capital is about, is the concentration, the rapid concentration of world private capital in these capital investment companies. So there's over 31 now that have over $1 trillion. But in the book, I really look at the top 10. So that's like BlackRock and Vanguard and State Street and UPS and Fidelity. And those 10 have $50 trillion worth of capital today. Actually, it's actually higher than that now. And so that is well over a doubling of concentrated capital in this group.
In just a few years.
5 years. So we saw, you know, with the pandemic and increased wealth of billionaires, decline and increase of people in extreme poverty, and a big increase in extreme poverty in the world, several hundred million, and wealth concentration. It's really hurting us.
And how can you get into that a little? Because I hear, you know, when I talk about wealth concentration with my Republican relatives, they don't think that that some people being extremely wealthy necessarily that there's a direct relationship between their wealth and the poverty of so many billions of other people. And I wonder if you could talk about that relationship.
Well, most of the people in the world live on less than $6 a day, over half. 80% of the people live on less than $10 a day. We've got extreme poverty, which is $2.15 a day. Has millions now, and it's hard to count because it's increased. And if you imagine living on that amount of money, even $10 a day for most people, you think, wow, that'd be really tough. But that's 80% of the world. And so we're faced here with highly concentrated wealth. People like Bezos and those are kind of the tip of the iceberg. Musk and his over 200 billion. The money that those aren't trillions. There's no trillionaires yet, although that may happen in the next few years. A trillion is 1,000 billions. So 50 trillion is 50,000 billions, and that's concentrated in the top 10 capital investment companies that are managed by only 117 people. So these 117 people, they decide where that money is going to be invested and how it will be invested. And one of their biggest problems is they don't have enough safe investment places to put it. So they do end up doing speculative investment, or they do investments in war capital that threatens all of us. They're highly invested in oil and gas. Then that's doubled even in the last 5 years. So this idea of global warming and trying to reverse that, it's just not happening because we're continuing to use so much oil and continue those high investments in that area.
Yeah, so the concentration of wealth is directly related to industries like the war industries and oil and gas and the death of humanity. So it very much affects everybody. Yeah.
And extreme poverty before the pandemic had been declining. The place where it was declined significantly was in China. China actually eliminated extreme poverty in their country. They still have 5 million plus people, 50 million people that are living on less than $5 a day. But the idea of extreme poverty, they deliberately wanted to eliminate that. So that's where extreme poverty declined in the world, primarily because of what the Chinese did. In the West and in the Western companies in Africa, India, extreme poverty increased, and it's still increasing. So to say, is there a relationship between concentrated wealth? Of course there is. If you've got the capital, the money, and you own 80% of the world's capital, and you're deciding where to invest it, you're not putting it in poor people, then of course you're impacting that.
The way that you break things down in your book and talking about the people that manage the accounts, that manage all that money, which is, I think, very interesting because we're not talking about the same people who own the money. These are people who are not even all of them are millionaires, according to your numbers. Although to some extent we don't know, right, how much.
Well, 117. There's a dozen or so that weren't millionaires until they got there.
Right.
And once you're on one of these boards, you're automatically paid at least $250,000, and then you get free stock. So within a year or two, you're a millionaire. So you get very rich very fast. But most of them are worth 5 to 20 million. The largest, the most wealthiest, has $6 billion worth of wealth. But their importance in terms of they're deciding where this $50 trillion is going to be invested. And all Western governments see them as what they call vital interest. So the vital interest of the West is money. And U.S. government will say, oh, we have bases around the world to protect our vital interests. That's exactly what it is. We've got military bases around the world to protect capital. And any government that interferes with our capital investment in some way is demonized or undermined or even attacked. So our wars have been historically based on control of capital and that sort of thing. And this has a cost. 20,000 people a day are dying from easily cured small diseases like flu and colds and things like that, and starvation, lack of nutrition. 20,000 a day. So that's, hundreds of thousands of people die annually from this gross inequality. And in my mind, we have to change that. That's just immoral, and it can't continue.
So immoral. And when you talk about the concentration of capital and how it becomes harder and harder to find profitable things to invest in over time as capital gets more concentrated, and then you talk about how they are sort of driven to invest more and more in things like military and sort of investments that are just sort of cannibalizing their own like state apparatuses and privatizing the public things. I mean, it seems like so this is somehow a phenomenon that has to do with the more intense concentration of capital, these kinds of investments.
I mean, this is worldwide, and we're highly invested in China. It's against the law to invest in any China companies that do business with their military. But their chip companies, other places, we're highly invested there. And we were invested in Russia, which became illegal after the Russians had invaded Ukraine or stepped into what was a civil war there. And but BlackRock lost like a 1% value for their investments in Russia. But they more than offset that by a 20% increase in the stock value in Lockheed Martin and all the war companies. So, I mean, they made a huge amount of money off of that war because all the U.S. and the Western capital war companies, Lockheed Martin, Halliburton, all of those, their stocks went up tremendously. So war is very profitable. Gas and oil continues to be profitable despite the threats of global warming and the severe weather that we've seen over the past several years.
That can be very profitable too, right? I mean, the severe global warming and everything getting destroyed, then it's great for the construction industry as long as society is still standing.
It continues to offer spending opportunities. Yeah, that's true.
And then investing in rebuilding places that have been destroyed by wars. It's another big. That's another big one. Huh? When you talk about in the book, there's at some point there's this top quintile idea. It seems like the world and many societies, at least in the United States, it seems like we have the top 20% or so that's living comfortably, and then you have everybody else that's in some way or another struggling to get by, and that kind of seems to break down globally with this kind of like these kinds of numbers, and it reminds me of the colonial. The mindset of any colonial power, how they're always looking to have like 15 or 20% of the population be a sort of relatively privileged. So
Right. Yeah, but the extremes are quite concentrated. It's the half of 1%, 40 million people, 36,000 of whom are billionaires, and many others are multimillionaires, 100 million, 500 million, and that have more than a million. That is whose money is sitting in these capital investment companies. So, so if you've got $100 million and you've got 50 million of that's cash and the rest in stock values or something, you turn that over to BlackRock and they will give you a 6 to 10% return. That's their goal. And these companies, of course, are competing with each other, but they're all cross-invested with each other. The top 10 capital investment companies have billions of dollars invested in each other. They watch each other very closely, and they're all invested in the same places. So this is a structured capitalism, capital return, concentrated wealth, managed by the money's 0.5% of the people in the world control this, and that's a great inequality that has negative consequences for thousands of people daily, and negative consequences for the environment, and for humanity in general. It's quite severe.
And for anybody living in the United States, like, with the BlackRock being number one, and BlackRock and what they're up to, I mean, especially anybody renting here, like, I mean, here where I live in this 2-bedroom apartment in Portland, Oregon, our rent has more than tripled in the past 18 years. And, it's these companies like BlackRock are investing in rental properties, and they're not building stuff, and they're not producing anything. They're just buying all this property and increasing
everything they can get their hands on. Absolutely. Yeah. And BlackRock's running over 10 trillion now.
10 trillion.
Yeah. So that's 10,000 billions. Just one company.
Back when in the 90s, when there was the global justice movement was happening, and a lot of people we were going around and protesting at World Economic Forum gatherings and World Trade Organization gatherings and International Monetary Fund and World Bank gatherings, and because we were collectively under the impression that these were the types of organizations and collections of capitalists that increasingly were running the world. And the point that the movement was trying to make was countries, I mean, one of the points was that if we were living in a supposedly democratic country, it should be we should be able to collectively and democratically decide our fate, rather than everything being decided in Davos.
I totally agree with that point of perspective. And it's actually increased. The Titans over the past decade have increased their participation at Davos and the World Economic Forum. They're very actively involved. And in fact, Fink, the head of BlackRock, is on the board of trustees. And they're all heavily involved. In my book, I, of course, identify the 117 people that manage this $50 trillion.
Most of whom go to Davos every year.
Pardon
me? Most of whom go to Davos every year.
73 of them go to Davos last year. So yeah, so I identify the 117 people. Then I say whether or not they're in the World Economic Forum in the year they joined. So they're highly participating there. It's very much part of the whole Schwab's idea that we're going to have a good capitalism, so to speak, a capitalism that will share and take care of people, and that kind of it's just wrong. It's just not true. They're apologizing. They say, "Oh, we're worried about global warming," but they're not doing anything about it. And they're worried. They say, "Oh, we're worried about war," but war is still big capital investment. So they are trying to make us feel better about, or trying to make the capitalists feel better about being capitalists, and saying that we're trying to do something to make the world a better place, but it's not happening.
It's not happening. But how much of that is, like, what you talk about ESG? What is it? What does that stand for? What is that about?
The
equitable.
equity, social, environmental, social,
Right.
and
How much of that is just window dressing? I mean, all these companies and entities, they have their PR departments and everything. And my impression is always like, when they talk about that, it's like the politicians talking about how we really do have a democracy and the corporations really don't have any influence, even though they're sending lots and lots of money to all these political campaigns. But they have to say that. I mean, it's part of their PR.
ESG was a PR campaign coming out of Davos, and that companies could say that they're concerned about the government, meaning democracy. They're concerned about equity. They're concerned about the environment. But it's not. That's not true. It's just gotten worse.
Yeah.
All of that. I mean, there's less democracy today. There's more environmental concerns, greater, and threats of war. I mean, it hasn't changed. It was nice window dressing for a while, but now that I think people just laugh at it.
And one of the sort of counterbalances to the power of the capitalists has traditionally been democracies, or the capacity of self-governance to still occur to some extent. But that just keeps on. I mean, in this country, all kinds of government institutions that used to be somewhat functional in various ways have just been eviscerated over time, right? So now now we have this situation where the Doge, they're just collapsing.
The president saying there's an oligarchy taking over the government.
Yeah. And there's this is talk about your take on the current moment. I know that's a huge question, but it's relevant to your book.
Trump is the ideal, president for the global titans. He's protecting global capital. He's allowing to continue to be concentrated. He's hiring billionaires to work in the cabinet. He has the richest man in the world trying to shut down the government. It's gotten extremely dangerous. There is no democracy in that respect.
No, and there's also Trump and his people don't seem to have. They're not doing the whole pretense thing anymore. Like they don't pretend that they're out to help anybody. Sometimes he'll say like, "Well, we have to take Greenland for the security of the free world" or something, because it sounded good at the time. But generally, it's just blatant business transactions, right? I mean, it's not. There's no pretense of we're trying to improve things in the world. I mean, in the sense of the way they usually talk about that, human rights and democracy, freedom, prosperity.
It's capital rights is all. What it's about, and certainly, I talk about heavily in the book, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, how people have a right to property, a right to work, a right to leisure, adequate standard of living, a free and fair world. These are all rights passed by the United Nations, and are supposedly part of what our values in this country, because the United States voted to support these. But it was Eleanor Roosevelt with a number of other scholars and philosophers that put this together right after World War II, and it's a very important document, which I think is not talked about much in this country and needs to be highly presented. And so I have a copy of it.
The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is that what you said?
Universal Declaration of Human Rights, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And for those people who are many out there that I keep on hearing from, who are suddenly getting politically mobilized now that Trump is doing what he's doing, but who were not particularly mobilized for years, how much of a bipartisan phenomenon is this ongoing concentration of wealth?
It's certainly more Republican than Democrat, but there's extremely rich Democrats. They give to both parties, although In the last election, they gave far more to Trump than they did to Biden or to Harris. And so, I tend to believe that the resources of the world ought to belong to humanity as a natural right for people, and that they should have. There's always been some inequality, but this extreme inequality that we're seeing and the consequences for millions of people, negative consequences, the threats of war, the destruction of the environment, this has to be reversed. We have to revolt against this oligarchy in any way, in all ways that we can. And that's why I wrote the book. That's why it's here. I identify the people who are behind this, and so you can call them up and bother them.
So you know who they are. Who are the people who are running the world into the ground?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, it's all public information. I look at the top 10 investment companies, who's on their board of directors, 117 people. I look at the bios of these people. They all went to private university, and for the most part, they're 50 to 60 years of age on average. They're heterosexual, usually married with kids, and they're 2/3 men, 1/3 women, and 60 of them are in the U.S., and the rest are spread all over the world.
Although I mean, at least the ones that are managing everything seem to be really concentrated in the U.S. and then secondarily in France and the U.K. I mean, it's very much in those countries, huh?
Right. It's where global capital is. No, we hear about the Chinese billionaires, but and there's as many billionaires in China as there are in the U.S. But the billionaires in China, they have nothing to say about the government. The Chinese Communist Party runs the government, and they don't dare make a peep, or they're not going to be around. And they're allowed to continue to concentrate wealth. But China's wealth concentration is only 5% of what the Titans have. So they're doing really well economically, and compared to the U.S., they've in all purposes exceed the U.S. now. Certainly in buying power, when you add buying power into their GDP, they're in excess.
Buying power of the average Chinese person.
Right. You add that into the GDP, and they're in excess of what the United States is today. So they have a lot of people that are still, on the low end of world wealth. But then they have an increasingly number of people who are middle class. They have, cars and houses and take vacations and are, have like an income level in the $30,000 to $40,000 range. And there's millions and millions of those. So that's been the China's increase.
Right.
And China has a philosophy where they believe that wealth should be shared, and that all people should have adequate means of universal, food, shelter, clothing, income, and that's the philosophy of the Chinese Communist Party.
And prosperity is actually happening. I mean, it is increasing all the time, and everybody I ever talked to from China is talking about it. No, yeah. I mean, they all feel like things are improving.
Shun. It's called Shun. And in my book on China, there's a chapter on China in the it's a chapter still, multipolar world.
Mm-hmm.
And so China has a middle class now, 350 million households, or 1 billion people earn over 30,000 a year, and their life expectancy is higher than the U.S. Their life expectancy is 78, U.S. is 76, and so they put it together a moderately prosperous society, in which they Chao Chang is a part of the philosophy. It actually goes back to Confucius, and Mike Whitney writes how the World Bank reports the drop of global poverty between 1990 was really more 100% from the Chinese alone.
And you talk about Russia as well, and the I think one thing that so many people in this country and around the world don't I'm pretty sure don't really realize to what degree the rising in the costs of energy and food and so many other things is related to the sanctions on Russia, and how that has played out around, causing so much hunger and misery in the world. Talk about Russia, and also, like, what about how does Russia factor into the Titan equation?
Their GDP is less than it was 20 years ago. It was, and the U.S., where the U.S. has just massively increased, Russia is still back where they were 20 years ago. And the war that they've had, they were provoked into that war in Ukraine. I mean, when Russia gave up all the territories that were Eastern Europe, and they became independent countries, and they were promised that they wouldn't expand NATO, but we lied. All those countries that became part of NATO, Ukraine hadn't, and Ukraine sits right on the underbelly of the Russia, and when we engineered a coup there that kicked out a pro-Russian government, brought in what had been sons of the fascists from World War II, and created a government that was strongly anti-Russia. And then the provinces in the south that are mostly Russian, they're all Russian-speaking people, resisted that, and Kiev sent in troops to occupy, and that was what started a civil war that Russia ultimately stepped into. Now, the CIA knew well that Russia would not give up the Crimea. That's their warm water port in the Black Sea. They were not going to give it up. And so they knew that would create a war that would be expensive for Russia, and continues to be, and would drain Russia even further. And the goal, of course, is to have a regime change in Russia and open Russia up to capital investment. They have lots of oil and minerals and forests and that could be expanded and developed. And Davos would like to see that. The Atlantic Council, which is the advisory board to NATO, has called for regime change in Russia. They've called for regime change in China as well. So NATO is a provocative military alliance that threatens Russia and is backing in many ways the Ukraine in their war with Russia.
And then the sanctions and the impact on wealth concentration and profit for the Western energy companies, American ones in particular. I mean, it seems like, in Europe, they're really suffering from electricity prices. I mean, I go to Europe a lot, and I never used to ever hear Danes complain about finances. But now you can hear Danes complain about their finances all the time. Right? Their energy prices have quintupled.
Yeah.
Sorry?
They were getting cheap energy from Russia.
Yeah, now it's very expensive energy from the U.S.
More expensive, and some of the pipelines have been destroyed mysteriously.
In the greatest act of environmental destruction in the history of the world, possibly that blowing up of the pipeline there.
Right, exactly.
So this.
David, when we talk about this stuff, it's really. It's quite clear. I mean,
it's hard to be optimistic, isn't it?
Well, it has to be addressed. And, we have all kinds of problems in the country, and Trump is doing all these different things. But when it gets right down to it, wealth inequality, capital concentration in 0.5% of the people is the most dangerous thing to democracy that we can talk about, and to our country's future.
What about as far as potential solutions to the whole problem? How much potential power do you see people having in at least ostensibly democratic countries? I mean, what about countries doing things like nationalizing the banks and seizing the wealth of their trillionaires?
All of that needs to happen. I think we should be doing that. But it's going to take a movement of people. Now, when Occupy happened, it scared the hell out of them. They thought that this was going to be a new revolution, young people challenging elites, challenging wealth concentration. They used police and security forces to infiltrate every Occupy group in the country and try to repress it. The media was engaged in describing how inappropriate Occupy was and the dangers that it presented to democracy and all that stuff. But another movement will come along, and there will be inevitably, and what it will entail, to what degree it will be revolutionary, would remain to be seen. But I think we have to encourage resistance in all ways. So my contribution is to give a book that tells you who we have to resist against. They're controlling us, where the money is, and I think that's an important contribution.
Yeah, no doubt. As Utah Phillips used to say regularly, the people that are destroying the world have names and addresses, and Peter Phillips has written the book with the names and addresses. Well, maybe not the addresses, but that's the names. Yeah, we can find their addresses.
Yeah, he was able to say those things and say them musically, which was kind of nice.
Yeah, definitely. It's much easy. It goes down much easier that way when it rhymes.
Reach more people that way than my putting out a book. But we're selling thousands of copies. I hope that it gets more attention. And now that Biden has said that there's an oligarchs are running the world, I think my book tells you who they are.
Yeah, so anybody interested in elucidating that last Eisenhower speech, the Eisenhower moment that Biden was trying to have there at the end of his presidency, yeah, the oligarchs he's talking about are well documented in the book. Thanks a lot, Peter. It's been a great pleasure talking to you again.
Yeah, picture of the book here, Titans of Capital.
And who's the publisher?
Huh?
I know this. You can find if you type it in the title online, it'll come right up. But
it will come right up, and
yeah,
it's from Censored Press and Seven Stories Press together, and is out all over the world.
Is there any audiobook plans for it by any chance?
Yes, there's one coming out. It's not out yet, but there's one pending.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Peter.
Great to talk to you, David.
Great to talk to you. See you again soon, I hope.
All right.
And that was Peter Phillips, author of the new book, Titans of Capital, How Concentrated Wealth Threatens Humanity. Everybody pick up a copy. I'm looking forward to the audiobook. And I will, if you want to listen to this interview on podcast form, go look up This Week with David Rovics. Wherever you got your podcast, it'll be there soon. And maybe I'll interview somebody else sometime soon, too. I've been talking to folks about that, and I haven't made any plans, but I'll let you know, and you'll see me pop up on the screen. Bye for now.